The official documentation provides an exhaustive account of a high-stakes Senate hearing defined by significant friction and rigorous oversight. At the center of this legislative inquiry sat Senator Josh Hawley, who leveled serious allegations against Colleen Shogan regarding her transparency. Shogan, nominated to oversee the National Archives and Records Administration, faced intense scrutiny over her prior public statements. The senator contended that the nominee had provided misleading testimony concerning her historical presence on social media platforms. This confrontation highlighted a fundamental disagreement over the disclosure of past political activities during the confirmation process. Previously, the nominee had asserted under oath that her private digital footprint was largely restricted to benign interests. She characterized her online interactions as being centered on innocuous topics such as domestic animals and athletic events. However, this narrative was sharply challenged when evidence suggested a more politically charged history on her social media profiles. The discrepancy between her testimony and the unearthed data became the primary catalyst for the ensuing debate. It raised critical questions about the accuracy of information provided to the Senate committee. During the proceedings, the candidate was presented with specific records of partisan posts that appeared to contradict her earlier claims. These posts reportedly delved into contentious public policy issues, including mandatory face coverings and firearm regulations. Furthermore, the evidence indicated that she had engaged in direct critiques of President Donald Trump. Such revelations stood in stark contrast to her initial description of a non-political and strictly personal online persona. This shift in the factual landscape forced a re-evaluation of her commitment to full disclosure. Throughout the duration of the interrogation, the witness consistently relied on a meticulously crafted linguistic defense to navigate the inquiries. She repeatedly invoked the concept of acting in a personal capacity to justify the nature of her past digital communications. This recurring phrase functioned as a strategic buffer intended to insulate her from direct accountability for the perceived inconsistencies. By framing her actions through this specific lens, she sought to separate her private opinions from her professional responsibilities. However, this defensive posture only seemed to intensify the frustration of the questioning legislators. Senator Hawley characterized this pattern of responses as a display of evasiveness that was largely without precedent in such hearings. He argued that the nominee's refusal to provide straightforward answers undermined the integrity of the advice and consent process. From his perspective, the persistent avoidance of factual reconciliation served as a disqualifying factor for the administrative role. The position of Archivist of the United States demands an individual who embodies total transparency and unwavering neutrality. Consequently, the senator maintained that the witness had failed to meet the ethical threshold required for the office. The broader implications of this exchange reflect a concerted effort to enforce accountability within the upper echelons of public service. The inquiry served as a mechanism to challenge an official who was accused of misrepresenting her background while under oath. Proponents of this rigorous questioning view it as a necessary safeguard against the politicization of neutral federal institutions. They argue that maintaining the sanctity of the National Archives requires a leader whose record is beyond reproach. Ultimately, the hearing underscored the volatile intersection of personal digital history and professional suitability in the modern era. In the halls of the United States Senate, the atmosphere remained heavy with the weight of constitutional duty and political skepticism. Every question posed was designed to peel back layers of carefully managed public imagery to reveal the underlying convictions of the nominee. The tension was not merely about social media posts, but about the fundamental honesty required of those seeking lifelong appointments. Legislators emphasized that the National Archives serves as the collective memory of the Republic, requiring a steward of immense character. Without such character, the institution risks losing its status as an objective repository of American history. The dialogue grew increasingly sharp as the senator pushed for a definitive explanation regarding the deleted or hidden content. He pointed out that the public's trust is a fragile commodity that cannot be easily restored once it has been compromised. The nominee's reliance on prepared talking points was seen by critics as a way to circumvent the spirit of the law. They posited that if a candidate cannot be honest about minor social media activity, they cannot be trusted with the nation's most sensitive records. This line of reasoning formed the backbone of the opposition's case against her confirmation. As the hearing progressed, the focus shifted toward the legal ramifications of providing contradictory statements to a congressional committee. Legal experts observing the proceedings noted that the standard for false testimony involves a complex assessment of intent and materiality. The senator's office argued that the omissions were material because they masked the candidate's inherent partisan leanings. On the other side, supporters of the nominee suggested that the focus on social media was a distraction from her professional qualifications. They viewed the line of questioning as an attempt to weaponize personal opinions against a career professional. The debate over personal capacity became a central theme that resonated far beyond the confines of the hearing room. It touched upon the growing difficulty of separating an individual's private digital life from their public-facing persona. In an age where every thought can be archived, the definition of what constitutes a private matter is constantly evolving. The Senate committee found itself at the forefront of this evolution, trying to set a standard for future nominees. This case established a blueprint for how digital footprints would be scrutinized in all subsequent confirmation hearings. The scrutinization of the nominee's digital history took a more granular turn as specific timelines were established during the official inquiry. Senator Hawley presented a series of exhibits that directly challenged the chronological accuracy of the witness's prior assertions regarding her online activity. These documents suggested that the partisan nature of the communications was not an isolated incident but rather a consistent pattern. The contrast between the documented evidence and the verbal testimony created a palpable friction within the Senate chamber's proceedings. It became increasingly clear that the committee was looking for a level of candor that the witness was hesitant to provide. The focus then narrowed to the specific content of the posts, which touched upon highly sensitive cultural and political flashpoints. One significant area of concern involved public health mandates, specifically the requirement for facial coverings during the national health crisis. The senator argued that the nominee's expressed views on this matter demonstrated a clear ideological alignment that could bias her administrative decisions. While the witness maintained these were private reflections, the committee weighed them against the requirement for nonpartisan leadership. Such topics are frequently viewed as litmus tests for an official's ability to remain objective under political pressure. Furthermore, the discussion delved into the candidate's public stance on the Second Amendment and various legislative efforts regarding firearm ownership. The records indicated a level of advocacy that went beyond mere personal interest, entering the realm of active political commentary. Senator Hawley emphasized that the National Archives must be managed by someone who does not harbor a visible agenda against constitutional interpretations. The witness's previous characterization of her social media as a place for sports and pets began to appear increasingly incomplete. This disconnect served as the primary evidence for the allegation that the Senate had been intentionally misled. In response to these specific exhibits, the nominee opted for a strategy of linguistic compartmentalization that drew significant criticism from the dais. She consistently redirected questions back to a predetermined narrative regarding her professional qualifications and her intent to serve the public. By refusing to engage with the specific wording of her past critiques of Donald Trump, she attempted to minimize their relevance. This tactic was perceived by the opposition not as a defense of privacy, but as a calculated avoidance of uncomfortable facts. The repetitive nature of her responses led to a breakdown in the traditional give and take of the hearing. Senator Hawley's critique of this behavior centered on the idea that transparency is the bedrock of a functioning democratic oversight system. He posited that if a nominee is willing to obscure their past during a confirmation hearing, their future conduct is suspect. The argument was made that the archivist position is uniquely sensitive because it involves the preservation of the truth itself. An individual who exhibits a flexible relationship with the truth during an interview is seen as a liability to the institution. Consequently, the senator framed the witness's evasiveness as a direct threat to the credibility of the federal record-keeping process. The legal implications of sworn testimony were repeatedly brought to the forefront of the conversation to remind the witness of her obligations. Congressional hearings operate under the premise that all information provided is truthful, accurate, and complete to the best of the witness's knowledge. Any perceived deviation from this standard can be interpreted as an attempt to obstruct the legislative process or provide false statements. The senator's line of questioning was designed to establish whether the omissions were accidental or part of a broader strategy of deception. This distinction is critical for determining whether the nominee's actions meet the legal threshold for perjury or misconduct. As the afternoon session progressed, the debate expanded to include the role of the National Archives in the modern political landscape. The agency is often caught in the crossfire of partisan battles over executive privilege and the release of sensitive government documents. Legislators expressed concern that a leader with a hidden partisan past might use their authority to influence the historical narrative. They argued that the only way to prevent such an outcome is to ensure the leader has no history of ideological bias. The nominee's refusal to acknowledge her previous statements made it difficult for the committee to grant her that trust. The concept of personal capacity was further dissected as the committee explored the boundaries between private citizens and public officials. In the digital age, a post made on a personal account can reach millions, effectively blurring the line between private thought and public advocacy. The senator pointed out that the witnesses' accounts were public at the time the posts were made, which complicates her defense. If the information was accessible to the general public, it cannot easily be dismissed as a purely private matter. This debate highlighted the growing need for clearer ethical guidelines for nominees in the era of ubiquitous social media. The tension reached a peak when the senator asked the witness to reconcile her specific insults toward the former president with her claim of neutrality. The witness's inability to provide a direct explanation for the discrepancy was highlighted as a major failure in her testimony. Critics of the nomination process often point to such moments as evidence of a culture of evasion among political appointees. They argue that nominees are coached to avoid giving substantive answers at all costs, even when faced with clear evidence. This behavior, while legally defensive, is often politically damaging in the eyes of the voting public and their representatives. Ultimately, this portion of the hearing served to solidify the opposition's stance that the nominee was unfit for the role. The focus remained squarely on the integrity of the process and the importance of holding state officials to a high ethical standard. By documenting these inconsistencies, the committee sought to provide a clear record of why the nomination should be contested. The proceedings underscored the reality that in Washington, the cover-up or the perceived evasion is often seen as more problematic than the original act. The session concluded with a stern reminder that the Senate's role in advice and consent is not a mere formality. The subsequent phase of the hearing transitioned into a broader discussion regarding the institutional standards expected of a high-ranking federal official. Members of the committee deliberated on whether the observed conduct reflected a temporary lapse in judgment or a fundamental character flaw. Senator Hawley continued to anchor the debate on the necessity of absolute transparency for an individual entrusted with the nation's most sensitive records. He emphasized that the National Archives must remain an entity shielded from the volatile shifts of partisan politics. The witness, however, remained steadfast in her utilization of specialized terminology to define her past actions. This clash of philosophies highlighted a growing divide in how public service and personal history are perceived in the current political climate. A significant portion of the inquiry was dedicated to examining the potential for future bias within the administration of the National Archives. Legislators expressed a collective concern that an individual who had previously voiced strong partisan opinions might struggle to exercise objectivity. The National Archives serves as the final arbiter of what remains in the public record, making the neutrality of its director a matter of national importance. When a nominee is perceived as hiding their past ideological commitments, it casts a shadow over their potential for future fairness. The committee argued that the role requires a person whose personal history does not conflict with the appearance of total impartiality. This requirement is not merely a preference but a prerequisite for maintaining the public's confidence in the objectivity of historical documentation. The discussion then turned toward the legal frameworks governing the testimony of executive branch nominees during the confirmation process. There was a rigorous debate over the definition of completeness in the responses provided by the witness to the committee's questionnaires. Legal experts on the committee pointed out that omissions can be just as problematic as direct falsehoods when they serve to mislead the Senate. The nominee's failure to disclose her active participation in political discourse was framed as a strategic omission designed to smooth the path to confirmation. Such a maneuver is often viewed as an affront to the Senate's constitutional duty to vet candidates thoroughly. This specific line of reasoning was used to argue that the witness had effectively violated the spirit of the oath she took at the beginning of the proceedings. In an effort to provide a more comprehensive defense, the witness attempted to pivot the conversation toward her extensive professional background. She highlighted her academic credentials and her long-standing commitment to the field of information management and historical preservation. By focusing on her technical expertise, she sought to diminish the weight of her social media activity as a secondary and irrelevant factor. However, the opposing senators were quick to note that technical skill does not excuse a perceived lack of candor. They argued that even the most qualified professional is unsuitable for high office if they cannot be trusted to be honest with the people's representatives. The tension between professional merit and ethical transparency became the defining conflict of this middle stage of the hearing. The role of prepared phrases in modern congressional testimony was also a subject of intense scrutiny during this session. It was noted that many nominees now arrive with a repertoire of noncommittal answers designed by legal counsel to minimize political risk. Senator Hawley identified this trend as a corrosive influence on the legislative oversight process, as it prevents genuine dialogue. The witness's reliance on the personal capacity defense was cited as a prime example of this professionalized evasion. Critics argued that such tactics treat the Senate committee as an adversary to be defeated rather than a partner in government. This approach, while perhaps legally safe, was portrayed as a significant breach of the traditional norms of transparency expected in the Capitol. Furthermore, the committee explored the historical precedents of previous archivists and how their personal histories were vetted. It was noted that the position has traditionally been held by individuals who have maintained a strictly nonpartisan public profile. The introduction of social media into the vetting process has added a new layer of complexity that previous generations of nominees did not have to navigate. This hearing was seen as a landmark case in establishing how digital footprints would be weighed against professional qualifications moving forward. The senator argued that the standards should not be lowered simply because the media through which opinions are expressed has changed. If anything, the permanence of digital records demands an even higher level of honesty from those who seek to manage them. The atmosphere grew more somber as the committee addressed the allegations of perjury and the potential consequences for the nominee's career. While a formal charge of perjury is a high legal bar, the political damage of being accused of providing false testimony is often irreparable. The senator reminded the room that the integrity of the federal government relies on the honesty of its participants. Any individual who is found to have manipulated their record to gain an advantage is seen as a threat to the stability of the bureaucracy. This part of the hearing served as a stern warning to all current and future nominees about the risks of being less than forthcoming. The message was clear. The Senate will not tolerate a sanitized version of history when it comes to the people who seek to lead federal institutions. As the session drew toward its conclusion for the day, the focus shifted to the impact of this controversy on the morale of the National Archive staff. Employees of the agency depend on a leader who is respected by both sides of the political aisle to ensure their work remains above suspicion. A director who begins their tenure under a cloud of ethical doubt can undermine the credibility of the entire organization. The committee heard arguments that confirming a nominee with such a controversial start would be a disservice to the career professionals at the archives. This institutional perspective added another layer of gravity to the proceedings, moving the conversation beyond just the nominee's personal conduct. The final segments of this day's hearing were marked by a call for more documentation and a more thorough review of all deleted social media content. The senator demanded that the witness provide a full accounting of all public statements made during the period in question. This request was intended to ensure that the committee had a complete picture before moving to a final vote on the confirmation. The witness's response to this demand was seen as a final test of her willingness to cooperate with the oversight process. It remained to be seen whether the candidate would embrace total transparency or continue to rely on the defensive strategies that had characterized her testimony thus far. The hearing served as a microcosm of the larger struggle for accountability in an increasingly polarized political environment. It demonstrated the challenges of vetting individuals in an age where their every thought may have been recorded and archived. For Senator Hawley and his colleagues, the issue was not just about a few posts on a website, but about the fundamental nature of truth in public life. They maintained that the American people deserve leaders who are willing to stand by their words and admit to their biases. Anything less was viewed as an unacceptable compromise of the standards that hold the Republic together. The inquiry moved into a complex philosophical and legal territory as the committee debated the boundary between a citizen's right to free expression and a public official's duty to remain impartial. This segment of the hearing scrutinized whether an individual's past exercise of their First Amendment rights could, or should, be used as a metric for their suitability for a nonpartisan role. Senator Hawley argued that while every American is entitled to their private opinions, a nominee for a position as critical as the Archivist of the United States must demonstrate a history of professional restraint. The witness's previous digital activities were not merely seen as personal expressions, but as indicators of an underlying ideological framework that could color her official actions. This brought up the difficult question of whether true neutrality is ever achievable or if it is merely a professional veneer that must be maintained. The nominee's defense centered on the idea that her private social media presence should be viewed in isolation from her long career of public service. She suggested that a person's ability to perform a job with integrity is not diminished by the existence of personal political views, even if those views are strongly held. However, this argument was met with skepticism from those who believe that the digital age has effectively ended the era of private political identities for public figures. The committee pointed out that when a person seeks a high-level government appointment, their entire history becomes a matter of public interest and scrutiny. The attempt to keep these two worlds separate was described by some legislators as an outdated approach to modern governance. One of the most contentious points of the session involved the analysis of the specific language used in the candidate's deleted or hidden posts. Senator Hawley highlighted that the tone of the communications was not just partisan but often derisive toward specific political figures and their supporters. He argued that this level of public animosity is inconsistent with the temperament required to lead an agency that serves all Americans regardless of their political affiliation. The witness was asked to explain how she could expect the public to trust her with the preservation of records that might be unfavorable to her personal views. Her inability to provide a satisfying answer beyond her prepared statements regarding her personal capacity further fueled the opposition's narrative of evasiveness. This perceived lack of candor had a ripple effect, leading to a broader discussion about the culture of the cover-up in administrative appointments. Legislators noted that the original sin was not necessarily the social media posts themselves, but the attempt to downplay or hide them during the initial stages of the vetting process. They maintained that if the nominee had been upfront about her past activities, the conversation could have focused on her growth and professional evolution. Instead, the focus remained trapped on the allegation that she had intentionally provided a false impression to the committee. This emphasis on the act of omission rather than the content of the speech itself shifted the debate from a matter of opinion to a matter of ethics and legal integrity. The impact of this behavior on the public's perception of the National Archives was a recurring theme throughout the afternoon. The agency is often described as the trustee of the nation's history, a title that carries an immense burden of perceived and actual objectivity. If the leader of such an institution is seen as a partisan actor who is dishonest about their background, the very records they protect may come under suspicion. Senator Hawley posited that the appointment of a controversial figure would lead to increased skepticism regarding the release of sensitive government documents. He argued that the American people must be certain that the individual holding the keys to the archives is not cherry-picking history to suit a specific political narrative. Furthermore, the committee explored the concept of administrative neutrality as a cornerstone of the American civil service. For decades, the professional bureaucracy has operated under the principle that officials should serve the public without regard to the changing tides of political power. The witness's past comments on controversial issues like gun control and health mandates were seen as a breach of this tradition. Critics on the committee suggested that her appointment would signal a move toward the politicization of neutral federal agencies. They argued that once the precedent is set that an official can hide their partisan leanings to get through confirmation, the entire merit-based system is at risk of collapsing. The legal defense provided by the nominee's supporters focused on the lack of a clear policy regarding social media for candidates for this specific office. They argued that it was unfair to hold the witness to a standard that had not been clearly defined before her nomination. From their perspective, the inquiry was an exercise in retroactive scrutiny intended to disqualify a highly capable professional on technicalities. However, the opposition countered that common sense and a basic commitment to truth should guide any person testifying under oath. They maintained that a nominee should not need a specific handbook to know that they must be honest about their public statements when asked by the United States Senate. As the hearing reached its later hours, the dialogue turned toward the broader societal implications of the cancel culture versus accountability debate. Supporters of the nominee characterized the questioning as a form of political harassment designed to punish an individual for having opinions. In contrast, the senator and his allies defined their efforts as a necessary part of the advice and consent process meant to protect the integrity of the government. This clash of worldviews made it clear that the hearing was about much more than a single nominee or a series of social media posts. It was a battle over the soul of the federal bureaucracy and the standards of behavior for those who aspire to lead it. The witness's persistent use of a defensive posture was also analyzed through the lens of institutional communication. It was noted that her responses were indicative of a broader trend where nominees are trained to survive the hearing rather than inform the committee. This survival at all costs mentality was cited as a primary reason for the decline in public trust in the legislative process. By refusing to speak plainly about her past, the nominee was seen as contributing to the very polarization she claimed to rise above. The senator emphasized that a leader who cannot face their own record with courage is unlikely to lead a major federal agency with the necessary resolve. Ultimately, this portion of the testimony solidified the ideological battle lines that would define the final vote on her confirmation. The focus remained on the discrepancy between the candidate's sworn statements and the digital evidence that told a different story. The session concluded with a lingering sense of unresolved tension, as the committee remained divided on whether the witness had met her burden of proof regarding her suitability for the role. The debate over her personal capacity had become a permanent fixture of the record, serving as a cautionary tale for all future participants in the democratic process. The final phase of the Senate inquiry focused on the long-term implications of the nominee's testimony for the future of the National Archives and the integrity of the confirmation process itself. Senator Hawley and his colleagues synthesized the day's findings, emphasizing that the issue at hand was not merely a series of digital inconsistencies but a potential breach of the public trust. The argument was made that when a candidate for high office provides a sanitized version of their history under oath, it undermines the very foundation of legislative oversight. The senator maintained that the National Archives, as the guardian of the nation's historical narrative, cannot be led by an individual whose own record is shrouded in ambiguity. This concluding segment of the hearing served as a definitive call for a return to the principles of absolute transparency and ethical clarity in public service. A significant theme that emerged during the closing remarks was the concept of administrative perjury and the difficulty of holding officials accountable in a hyper-polarized environment. While the witness had relied on a meticulously crafted defense to avoid direct contradictions, the cumulative effect of her evasiveness was seen by critics as a form of deception. The senator argued that the Senate must not accept a standard where technical truth is used to obscure a larger pattern of misinformation. He posited that the role of a public servant requires a higher degree of candor than what is legally required to avoid a criminal charge. This distinction between legal compliance and ethical leadership became the central takeaway for those observing the proceedings. Furthermore, the hearing prompted a serious discussion about the future of the advice and consent role of the Senate in an era of ubiquitous digital information. Legislators acknowledged that the vetting process must evolve to meet the challenges posed by social media and the permanence of online speech. The confrontation between Senator Hawley and the nominee established a new precedent for how a candidate's past digital persona would be weighed against their professional aspirations. It sent a clear signal to future nominees that their public and private lives are no longer separable when they seek to lead federal institutions. This evolution is seen as a necessary adaptation to ensure that the individuals who manage the government are held to the same standards as the records they protect. The debate over the nominee's personal capacity was finally addressed as a problematic loophole that needs to be closed in future ethics agreements. Critics argued that allowing officials to hide behind this phrase enables them to maintain partisan identities while claiming professional neutrality. The committee suggested that a more robust framework is needed to define the ethical boundaries for potential leaders of nonpartisan agencies. This would involve a more comprehensive disclosure of all public statements, regardless of the platform or the perceived capacity in which they were made. By formalizing these requirements, the Senate aims to prevent the kind of friction and confusion that defined this particular hearing. The broader institutional impact on the National Archives and Records Administration was also a point of deep concern as the session drew to a close. There was a consensus that the agency requires a leader who can command the respect of both political parties to ensure the continuity of its mission. The controversy surrounding the nomination was seen as a potential distraction that could hinder the agency's ability to perform its duties. Senator Hawley emphasized that his opposition was rooted in a desire to protect the archives from the perception of bias. He argued that the only way to safeguard the institution's reputation is to ensure its director is an individual of unquestionable integrity and transparency. As the final statements were entered into the record, the focus returned to the specific allegations of false testimony and the need for accountability. The senator framed the entire inquiry as a vital effort to ensure that no official is above the law or the truth. He maintained that providing misleading information to a congressional committee is a serious offense that must have consequences for one's career. The goal of the confrontation was to demonstrate that the Senate will not be a rubber stamp for nominees who are less than forthcoming about their past. This commitment to accountability is seen as a crucial check on the power of the executive branch and a protection for the American people. The hearing concluded with a reflection on the role of truth in the American democratic system. It was noted that in a time of widespread misinformation, the institutions responsible for preserving the truth must be led by those who value it above all else. The witness's performance was characterized by some as a missed opportunity to demonstrate the very transparency she would be required to uphold. For her detractors, the session provided ample evidence that her commitment to the truth was secondary to her desire for confirmation. This fundamental disagreement over her character and conduct would go on to shape the final vote and the future of the agency. The long-term legacy of this hearing will likely be seen in the increased scrutiny applied to all future political appointees. The Holy Shogun Exchange has become a reference point for how to conduct a rigorous cross-examination of a nominee's digital history. It serves as a reminder that in the modern age, there is no such thing as a truly private political life for those who wish to serve in the highest levels of government. The standards of transparency have been permanently raised, and the expectation of honesty under oath has been reaffirmed. This shift is viewed by many as a positive development for the health of the Republic and the integrity of its institutions. Ultimately, the source material portrays the event as a necessary and justified attempt to hold a state official to account for her alleged misrepresentation of her record. The rigorous questioning was not seen as a partisan attack but as a fulfillment of a constitutional duty to vet candidates for the benefit of the public. By documenting the inconsistencies in the witness's testimony, the committee provided a clear rationale for its skepticism. The hearing ended not just as a debate over a single individual, but as a defense of the principles of honesty and accountability that are essential for a functioning democracy. The proceedings left an indelible mark on the political landscape, highlighting the ongoing struggle to define the ethics of public service in a digital world. As the Senate moved toward a final decision, the questions raised during the hearing continued to resonate with the public and the media. The case served as a stark reminder that the path to public office is paved with the words of one's past, and those words will always be subject to the light of truth. In the end, the effort to ensure accountability was seen as a vital step in maintaining the high standards that the American people expect and deserve from their government.